Okay, cool. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final semester of the Fall 2020 Biology, Ecology, and Evolution Seminar Series, or BEES for short. The seminar series is organized by graduate students in the Applied Ecology and Biology departments. We continue to be grateful for the support of the department and health, especially as we continue to welcome speakers via the cyber realm. Just to remind you of some logistics as we have our speaker today, I would ask that you keep yourself muted during Dr. Bailey's presentation. If you do questions while Dr. Bailey is speaking, please feel free to type it in the chat, and she may get to it during the seminar, but more likely it will be addressed at the end of the seminar. At the end of the talk, we will have 10 to 15 minutes for questions. Please indicate that you have a question in the chat, and either Umbar or I will ask folks to unmute themselves or read the question aloud if they're short. And so with that, I would like to introduce Dr. Bailey. Dr. Karen Bailey is an assistant professor in the Environmental Studies program at the University of Colorado Boulder. She earned her BS from Princeton in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology with a certificate in African American Studies, her master's from the University of Florida in the Department of Wildlife Ecology and Conservation, her PhD in 2019 at the University of Florida in the School of Natural Resources and the Environment. Dr. Bailey also recently completed a postdoctoral appointment at the University of Colorado Boulder in the Environmental Studies program. Her research focuses on human-nature interactions and climate change with the overlapping goal of supporting human well-being, sustainable resource management, and equity. Dr. Bailey has recently published commentaries in Nature, Ecology, and Evolution on the institutional racism facing people who are Black, Indigenous, and other people of color in conservation, as well as the overlooked contributions of Black women in ecology and conservation. We are very fortunate to have Dr. Bailey with us today, and with that, I will let her take it away.
All right, thanks. I often say that I kind of have to preface my whole existence. I have 3 degrees with the word ecology in them, and I am no longer an ecologist. It's all a farce at this point. So if anybody wants to talk about making pivots in your academic career, I am ready to share those experiences, but just an important preface. Hopefully you know by the title as advertised that I will not be focusing too heavily on ecology. All right, gonna share my screen. All right, can everybody see that? Okay. So thanks so much for having me today. I'm really excited to be here and to share some of my work on climate change, social capital, and sustainable livelihoods in conservation landscapes. So just an outline of kind of what I'm going to cover today. I'm going to talk briefly about global change and livelihoods, then describe kind of what I mean about conservation landscapes and the conservation landscapes I'm currently working in. Then I'll talk specifically about climate adaptation, conservation, and social capital through 3 case studies where I've looked at some of those linkages. Some of the conclusions, and then if I have time, on talking a bit about ongoing and future research. So a lot of my work centers on global climate change and global change processes that have really significant impacts on every facet of life, right? Human well-being and survival, ecological and ecosystem function, wildlife, conservation, all are impacted and intrinsically linked to these global change processes. And it's absolutely critical to understand how we impact change and how global change impacts us. My work tends to focus on the impacts of drought, just because that's kind of where I've often found myself and the issues I've been forced to think about, but increasingly in other landscapes, and as I kind of broaden my research portfolio, focusing on other aspects of climate change as well. This is a collection of headlines from the New York Times, really just illustrating how severe the challenge associated with drought in particular is, how it's a global challenge we're all facing, and how there's kind of an increasing need for us to figure out what to do with it, or rather what to do about it. So the impacts of climate change are especially pronounced when it comes to smallholder farmers in low and middle income countries. And those are primarily the contexts within which I work. These communities disproportionately bear the burden of negative impacts from climate change and will continue to do so as it intensifies. When climate change impacts these communities, crops fail, livestock die, livelihoods are overturned, and these really significant impacts are important to study so that we can build strategies for resilience from both the human perspective and the environmental and ecological perspective. When I talk about smallholders, I want to describe a little bit more of what I mean there. As I said, global change is especially important for smallholder farmers, which are those that typically support a single family with a mixture of cash crops and subsistence crops, so not exclusively being eaten in the home, but being used to support broader livelihood needs. Smallholders represent a really significant proportion of the world's global population, with over 500 million farmers and 2 billion people relying on small holdings. And this map shows the distribution of smallholder farms of different sizes across Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Much of the world's land is devoted to these small-scale farming and grazing uses. And because these communities are heavily reliant on rain-fed agriculture and natural resources, they're highly vulnerable to these global changes. So as I mentioned, I have lots of degrees with the word ecology in them. So as somebody who is trained as an ecologist, and as somebody who has a strong interest in conservation and both sustainable livelihoods, I often work and collaborate with folks who work with smallholder communities living in conservation landscapes. And conservation landscape is a very vague term. And when I use it, I generally mean a landscape that is identified as important for biodiversity conservation by some entity somewhere that may be threatened by global environmental and anthropogenic changes. These landscapes, in addition to their biodiversity, their relevance as far as biodiversity conservation goes, they're often have communities that are heavily directly dependent on natural resources, and thus both human and environmental and ecological processes in these landscapes are impacted by global change. So I'm currently working in 3 conservation landscapes, the Maputaland-Pondoland Albany Biodiversity Hotspot in Southern Africa, which includes regions of South Africa, Mozambique, and eSwatini, formerly Swaziland. And this region is known for incredibly high levels of plant diversity and plant endemism, including one of the highest tree diversity of any temperate forest in the world. The second conservation landscape is in the Kavango-Zambezi Transfrontier Conservation Area, or KAZA. And this region is most well known for its large elephant populations and is really critical for African and global elephant conservation. And the final conservation landscape is in East Africa in the East Albertine Rift, or the Eastern Afro-Montane Biodiversity Hotspot. And this region is also well known for endemism, particularly bird and plant species as well, and then also really important for primate conservation. So within each of these contexts and each of these conservation landscapes, much of my work is at the intersection of climate change, human-environment interactions, adaptation, and human health. And so my overall research motivation is to understand these linkages between climate change, smallholder livelihoods and adaptation, well-being and human-environment interactions, and the implications for social environmental systems more broadly and conservation landscapes. The title of my talk includes the term social capital. I'll talk a little bit about it more, but in my work, I'm often focused on the role and value of social networks and social resources to support sustainable natural resource use and resilience and adaptation that comes along with that, and really to figure out how social networks help us better understand some of the drivers of human-environment interactions. I and many others in my sort of field of social ecological systems research focus on it because we have seen the critical role that it can play in supporting resilience, particularly among vulnerable communities. So I'll now transition into a few case studies that kind of illustrate why I focus on social capital and sort of how we've seen it play out as important or less important in some contexts. So this first case study is from eSwatini, as I said, formerly Swaziland. They changed their name about 2 years ago. We worked with communities in eSwatini to understand how climate change impacted their livelihoods and what their response to these impacts were. So just some context, eSwatini is a small country in Southern Africa, one of the ones that's inside of South Africa. And it's home to many smallholders with more than 75% of the population depending on farming and natural resource-based livelihoods. The primary staple crop is maize, and incomes are generally low, averaging between $300 and $2,500 per year, based on some research that we've done in the region. Importantly, average rainfall varies pretty significantly across the country, from about 450 to 1,400 millimeters annually, and this map showing what that trend looks like. As I said, Eswatini is, Eswatini is one of the countries within this Maputoland, Pondoland, Albany biodiversity hotspot. It's a mouthful. And so again, to kind of reiterate, I think that my work focused on humans in these landscapes is really important for biodiversity conservation more broadly, because human use of the landscape and human natural resource use on the landscape is heavily impacted by changing environmental conditions. Eswatini is also experiencing really significant and increasingly severe impacts from climate change, including one of the most severe droughts in recorded history between 2015 and 2016. Rain fell to below 65% of averages, and maize yields, maize being the primary crop, declined to less than half, as this figure shows here, with maize yields dropping from around an average of 80,000 tons to less than 40,000 tons. Declines in water and also declines in the quality and availability of grazing land also led to tens of thousands of cattle dying. And cattle, in addition to sort of supporting food security, are incredibly important sources of income during times of need, and also culturally relevant for many different reasons in the region. So loss of cattle is very significant. And further, this headline here kind of indicates the extent of the food insecurity that was the result of this drought, with many students attending school simply so that they could access food. So this drought context was a really severe one, and I happened to be in Eswatini doing related and somewhat unrelated research when I decided to shift my work to study this. So when I think about what adaptation to something like drought looks like, and if and how households and individuals are able to effectively adapt, and what that might mean for the environment, I use the concept of adaptive capacity, which is broadly the ability to effectively respond to or take advantage of change and changing environments. To measure this, I borrow from the Sustainable Rural Livelihoods framework, which hypothesizes that adaptive capacity is driven by access to and quality of 5 types of capital, 5 or more types of capital. The ones I focus on here: physical, financial, natural, human, and social capital. And I'll sort of briefly describe what each of those are. Physical capital refers to access to local infrastructure, things like roads and hospitals, and then at the sort of household level, physical durable assets, things like buildings, tractors, cell phones, right? What people have access to in their home. Financial capital refers to household wealth and includes access to loans, startup capital, and income from employment and small business and sales of like things that are grown on the farm. Social capital refers to the extent to which individuals are involved in local social networks, just to hone in on what this means a little bit more. And then I break it down to this idea of structured and unstructured social capital, where unstructured social networks, such as communicating or casually trading with neighbors, and then conversely, more structured social capital, such as working for or hiring your neighbors or participating in a structured community organization. Natural capital encompasses the availability and quality of local natural areas and the resources they provide, such as farmland, grazing land, water, forests, and the livestock and wildlife and other animals that they support. And finally, human capital encompasses the skills, knowledge, and experience that people have, including things like education and training and different aspects of employment. So the prevailing hypothesis in this space is that increased availability to potentially any type of capital improves your overall adaptive capacity or your ability to adapt to changing environmental conditions. However, it's less clear if one type of capital might be more important in increasing adaptive capacity than others. There's some evidence that in certain contexts, depending on the nature of the perturbation that someone's adapting to and the nature of the broader environmental context, that one type of capital might be more important than others. And I was interested in this question because if we want to improve adaptation to climate change in the future and improve it in a way that's sustainable and beneficial for both humans and environmental and ecological processes, it's really important to identify what the most critical piece of that adaptation process is and how we can make it most efficient. So to do this, this work combined qualitative and quantitative social science methods to collect data, first conducting focus group interviews with community members to get a sense of community history, climate change that they've observed recently, economic trends, organizations, communities, leadership that's operating locally. And then thinking about what adaptations are available to people. What have you done in the past when the climate has changed? What might folks be doing now? And then some participatory mapping as well to get a sense of kind of where the communities are operating on the landscape, what natural resources are available for folks to draw on, how the landscape is changing, how the population is changing, and sort of what are the community boundaries to get us a sense of who's there. We then developed a quantitative household survey that we conducted with about 300 households across 6 communities. And during each survey, we collected data on household demographics to get a sense of who's in the household, and then capital, right, going across those 5 types of capital that you just described, and really importantly, adaptation behavior and adaptation success. So in response to this most recent drought, we asked households, what have you done? What have you changed? And has it been successful in increasing either food consumption, income, or agricultural output? So based on the focus groups and the preliminary research, we developed a suite of indicators for each type of capital that could be quantitatively measured to be used in statistical models. There's a lot here, so I'm not going to go over all of it. I'm just going to focus in on one type of capital. With natural capital, for example, we asked households to quantify their most recent crop harvest in terms of kilograms, the amount of farmland they own, if they collect wild foods of any kind to eat, or if they hunt in any way, how far they're traveling to collect fuel wood to get a sense of where natural resources of relevance are on the landscape, and then also things like livestock. In case folks are interested, these are really highly correlated variables, so we did use an ordination technique to condense the variables to account for that. Now, I've been sort of vaguely talking about adaptation, and so I want to sort of concretize that a bit more. So based on our focus group discussions and our conversations and surveys, this is an overview of some of the primary types of adaptations that were most commonly used and at what rates they were considered successful. So most commonly, households relied on or modified existing farming activities. So right, planting drought or heat-resistant crops, or cash crops in particular, things like cotton, wheat, sorghum, sunflower, mushrooms in some cases. But it's worth noting that, 28% reported success in that case, right? I can't overemphasize how severe the drought was, and it's really interesting for our results in terms of what ended up being most important. Additionally, there was a common strategy of conservation farming, which is essentially modifying your farming practices to maintain soil moisture and quality and minimize things like soil erosion. Many folks also tried to look for work away from the farm or migrating to cities in eSwatini and in surrounding countries as well, raising and selling chickens, selling crafts, selling natural resources, and engagement in local community organizations that have a number of different functions. Also beekeeping with pretty low success. So looking directly at the link between adaptation and capital, we found that adaptation is positively associated with capital diversity. That is the spread of a household's capital across the 5 different types. So this is just idealized or generalized data here, but it shows the difference between a diverse set of capital that's evenly spread across the 5 types or a non-diverse spread with one type. And then the regression results that I'm showing you here show that positive relationship, such that as this index, which is on the x-axis of capital diversity, increases, The number of adaptations that a household attempted also increased. So households were more likely to attempt to adapt their livelihood in some way in response to the drought if they had a broader spread of capital across the 5 types. Focusing in more on that question of kind of which type of capital might be more important, it might not come as a surprise given the title of my talk, but among the different types, we found that social capital was most strongly correlated with adaptation attempts and adaptation success. So this graph shows standardized beta coefficients, which are an indicator of the strength of a particular variable on an outcome. And what we saw is that social capital has the largest non-zero, non-overlapping zero coefficient, which indicate that it has the strongest relationship with adaptation. So households with higher levels of social capital were more likely to report attempting adaptations and also having successful adaptations. Natural capital was also associated with adaptation, but the relationship wasn't as strong. We also found that structured social capital, as I mentioned, that distinction between structured and unstructured social capital, in particular working for and hiring neighbors, right? So there's an actual structured relationship and there's some sort of system in place for exchange of information, ideas, resources, et cetera. And participation in community organizations, again, providing a structure for exchange of resources, was positively correlated with the probability of having a successful adaptation. So regardless of the number of adaptations that you tried, your likelihood of having a successful adaptation increased when you were more engaged in some sort of structured social capital. So what we can conclude from this is that social capital is really critical for supporting livelihoods and supporting adaptation to climate change. Structured social capital, as I said, in particular, we found that it is important for establishing and strengthening pathways for exchange of information, right? How can I learn a new adaptation? How can I try something new? Opportunities, right? What's out there for me to learn about and try? And other exchange of other types of capital. I want to try this certain adaptation, but I don't have the physical resources to do it. So social capital provides access to the other types of capital. And really importantly, it takes households beyond kind of knowing and communicating with each other and provides a stable safety net in times of stress. Increasing structured social capital and opportunities for that structured exchange of resources is really critical to enabling and supporting future adaptation. So this might include creating and devoting more resources to community organizations, providing capital to support the structure of those organizations, and searching for new opportunities to bridge and link households in structured ways. So from my perspective, and I think from the perspective of a lot of folks that work in low and middle income countries that have decreased access to some of the structures that we benefit from here in the US, this is really exciting news. Communities in eSwatini and in similar rural areas are rich in this social capital and have really great potential to grow this structured social capital. Strong social networks already exist between neighbors, church groups, and schools that can be tapped into to help people as our climate changes. And while this wasn't an explicit focus of this particular research, I think it is worth noting that communities, we found from this work that communities with stronger social networks were less likely to report degradation and fragmentation in the surrounding savanna landscapes, were more confident in the sustainability of the livelihoods and the natural resources on which they rely, and also tended to express a greater appreciation for local wildlife and the potential of local wildlife to improve livelihoods rather than have a negative impact. So that's definitely a direction for future work in this space. So I'm going to move to a second case study here. And so that was kind of the work in eSwatini was early on in my career where I started to get a sense of what social capital was and how it could be beneficial. So after gaining those really interesting insights, I wanted to learn more about the ways in which social networks support both human livelihoods and potentially broader conservation goals. So the next case study I'll share here is from Uganda in the Albertine Rift, and specifically around Bwindi Impenetrable National Forest, shown here. Bwindi, as I said, or rather the region, is well known for being one of the last remaining homes of the mountain gorillas. And so it's incredibly important for both wildlife conservation and also funding from ecotourism. So this region that surrounds Bwindi is also really important for sustainable livelihoods. In the past few decades, there's been a significant increase in the local population outside the park, leading to really high population densities directly adjacent to the park. And so here you can see that really sharp forest boundary where the park begins and where the agriculture basically abuts right and goes right up to it. So the population is growing outside the park, which is in part because this is a volcanic landscape. And so there's incredibly volcanic soils, fertile volcanic soils in the region. So people are migrating from areas where there's less soil fertility into this already densely populated region. And so there's concerns surrounding the capacity of the landscape to provide, so concerns related to food security, and then also the potential for illegal resource extraction within the park as these populations directly grow and expand right up against it. Another key consideration in the region is this tension, like I said, between the needs of local communities and conservation goals. So historically, as in many similar landscapes across the world, communities living in this region have been highly dependent on forest resources, things like timber, firewood, medicinal plants, forest wildlife. And when the park became established, and as the landscape outside the park continued to be changed, many people lost access to the natural forests in the region. So in response to this need for forest products, largely wood products, and in response also to kind of changing economic markets, there's been an increase in the planting of trees outside of the protected areas. These plots, which are shown here, are called woodlots, and they represent really an important adaptation strategy for changing livelihoods and changing environmental conditions. They also represent a potential strategy for kind of minimizing pressure for these forest products on Bwindi National Park. It's worth noting that they're not native species. They're primarily pine and eucalyptus that are fast growing and easily sold in local markets. But they are serving as a source of forest and wood products for these communities. So how does social capital come in? In Bwindi, there are these really interesting local social organizations known as stretcher groups or stretcher societies. The stretcher groups were first formed due to the steep terrain in the region, and I hope my pictures, that's part of the reason why it's super steep here. I was there, I could barely make it up, it's real steep. So there's this really steep terrain, most of the roads aren't paved, it's wet year round, so it's just kind of hard to get around. And there's also limited access to healthcare. So these stretcher groups are essentially emerged as a way to transport the sick and infirm and also the deceased around the community on foot, hence the term stretcher, right? So literally carrying people on stretchers from their homes to wherever they need to go. And they have since evolved into kind of a broader social organization that provides a lot of really important critical services and such as mediation, such as a sort of local level of governance below a local chairperson, and also kind of the environmental management and the management rather of natural resources. Importantly, stretcher groups also own woodlots. So woodlots can be either privately owned or they can be collectively owned by stretcher groups or other local social organizations. So given this context of forest-dependent communities, a biodiversity hotspot, and these stretcher groups as social organizations and institutions that are really important and have a long history, I think it provided us an opportunity to investigate how access to woodlots support local livelihoods, and if there are any differences in access between privately owned woodlots and stretcher group owned woodlots, right? So how are woodlots being managed, and how are they potentially being managed differently when they're privately owned and when they're collectively owned via these social organizations? So working in 12 communities outside Bwindi, shown here, we conducted focus groups, again, combining qualitative and quantitative social science data collection methods to understand demographics, livelihood strategies, what folks are growing, what folks are eating, what folks are selling, forest product needs, where people are sourcing forest products from, engagement with stretcher groups, and then also some of the characteristics of woodlots. What am I doing for time? Okay. So this figure here just shows some of the main resources that households are using, and using woodlots for, rather. And they include like building materials such as timber, poles, and stakes that they might be using locally or also selling beyond the community. And additionally, products like firewood and charcoal that are primarily for energy use. And these products really importantly support daily on-farm activities and off-farm economic strategies. Like I said, economic markets were changing, and so the growth and sale of timber has become really important in the region. Other here includes some of those medicinal plants that I talked about before, but they're not being used in large amounts. So from here on out, I'm going to be focused on some of these wood products. We also wanted to get a broad sense of whether or not households were getting what they needed for their daily activities from these woodlots, or more generally. So we asked households the broader question of, are you able to meet your household wood product needs? And what we found is that 70% of households are able to get what they need to support their daily livelihood activities, and 30% are not. Right, so that 30% is really important. If they're not getting it, there are significant sort of equity and livelihood concerns. There's also the capacity for impacts on the national park. When we looked at the role of stretcher groups in the region, we found that while stretcher groups are really important, almost all households are involved. It's kind of a de facto understanding that you're going to be involved in a stretcher group when you become a certain age. There's a gender dynamic there that's relevant, but at the household level, most people are involved in stretcher groups. And many stretcher groups own woodlots. Roughly 70% of stretcher groups also have woodlots that they own and manage. But what we also found really interestingly is that most households are not sourcing these daily wood products, timber, poles, stakes, firewood, charcoal, from stretcher woodlots. They're sourcing them from privately owned woodlots. Stretcher group owned woodlots serve needs that are more related to their founding, selling timber to pay for emergencies, constructing coffins, and building community structures. So these woodlots form more of a kind of broad scale community social safety net, as opposed to providing the resources that are needed for daily activity. And so accordingly, since daily household wood needs were not generally sourced from stretcher group owned woodlots, we found that not having access to a stretcher group owned woodlot didn't actually impact whether or not a household was able to meet their wood product needs. So this figure here shows, oh, those are backwards. Okay, so pink is actually wood needs met, the proportion of households that said they were able to meet their household wood needs, and blue is the opposite, household wood needs unmet. And in the first two columns, you can see that access to private woodlots and access to stretcher and private woodlots, essentially no difference, right? So again, whether or not a household is actually able to meet their wood product needs on a day-to-day basis isn't significantly impacted by what the stretcher group is doing. And similarly, in the last two sections, access to households that only had access to stretcher group owned woodlots and households that didn't have woodlot access at all are again quite similar in terms of whether or not they're able to meet their household wood product needs. And so this is a really interesting finding because it kind of supports this understanding that social networks, in this case, the stretcher groups, are important, but they're not important necessarily for day-to-day activities. And so the roles that they're going to play in minimizing overall impacts on the landscape are quite different, or at least different than we had anticipated going in. So despite that finding, we did find that stretcher group owned woodlots, while they don't necessarily support these daily wood product needs, we did learn about some other important roles that they play. So those who participate in stretcher groups that have woodlots are able to get a great deal of experience managing these woodlots, right? They understand what it takes or what's necessary for pruning trees. They know how to get the right seeds. They understand when they need to be harvested, right? And so this provides really critical knowledge and knowledge transmission for supporting their own forest and woodlot management. There's also this broader social network that supports livelihood activities. A lot of people who don't have access to their own or don't own their own private woodlots are able to get firewood that they need by collecting from friends, family, neighbors, other stretcher group members who do own private woodlots. So there's this social network that's created that supports access to these resources that are needed for day-to-day activities. Natural resource conflict mediation and conflict management. So sometimes, as one could expect, there are conflicts over who has access to what and how it should be used. And stretcher groups can be really important in terms of mediating and managing those conflicts, and also, I think, supporting kind of broader sustainable natural resource use. As I said, resources during times of stress, right? If there is an emergency in the community, if the community has broader needs, the access to stretcher groups and the access to the income that is stored in stretcher group owned woodlots can really support the community during these times. And finally, a little bit more abstract, but this idea of collective governance that allows them to negotiate beyond the community and strengthen relationships with the national park. So there's a lot of, as I said, Bwindi is really important kind of globally for its protection of mountain gorilla populations. And there's a lot of work locally to have communities be involved, but stretcher groups and collective action of stretcher groups provides local communities with an opportunity to speak as one voice to ensure that they're gaining benefits and that they're being treated fairly in the management of the broader conservation landscape. All right, I think I have time for that. Okay, I'll power through. So the last case study, and it's a bit more qualitative, so I should be able to get through it quicker, comes from the Kabango-Zambezi Transfrontier Conservation Area. So this is a conservation area that spans 5 countries and is home to both humans and wildlife. And this is kind of a crazy map, but basically it shows you the size of it and the different types of management areas. There's national parks, there's forest reserves, there's commercial wildlife, and there are these community conservation areas, which we're focused on. They also show the number of elephants that are living in these landscapes. So Botswana has about 150,000, Zimbabwe 62,000, Zambia a lot fewer, Angola a lot fewer as well, Namibia at about 13,000. So community-based conservation has really emerged globally to better link the goals of conservation, human well-being, and kind of sustainable landscapes. And essentially, it's a social network that's being leveraged in order to support these goals. So effective community-based conservation, it ideally strengthens and leverages these local social networks to support livelihood opportunities. So providing a bit of broader context, as I said, that first map showed all of the elephants and the numbers of elephants that live in the region. So a key factor to consider when we think about how community-based conservation is managing natural resources and sort of the broader conservation goals of CASA is this potential for human-elephant conflict. Elephants in the region are quite abundant and regularly cause crop loss and crop damage, and sometimes more severe injury and death. I think in the past maybe 3 years, there's been about 15 people who have been killed by elephants and probably roughly the same number of elephants that have been killed in retaliatory action, right? So there's a lot of challenges surrounding human-elephant conflict. And in part, this occurs because of the spatial distribution of elephants and the fact that communities are living near water, which elephants also need, and their movement is largely governed by their need to access water. And so they might move towards water, going through Chobe Enclave, which is a long-running community-based conservation area, passing through homes, communities, and maize fields on the way to water, right? And so causing lots of damage as they go through. And what our research has shown is that crop predation, mostly by elephants, although other species are sometimes involved, can severely impact household food insecurity. So this figure here is similar to the one I showed earlier, and it's essentially coefficients that estimate the impact of the variable on the outcome of food insecurity. I won't go over everything here, but the primary takeaway is that crop predation negatively impacts household food insecurity in a really significant way, and that the other sources of sort of livelihood strategies that might mitigate this, other sources of income, are not sufficient necessarily to offset the impacts of that crop predation. Further exacerbating this is the fact that the climate is rapidly changing in Gaza. We're back in Southern Africa here, where climate change is predicted to get, predicting the region to get drier and wetter, and drier and hotter. And so we're seeing that, and across the region there are major declines in rainfall and increases in temperature leading to drought, which is doubly impacted, right? Because now there's less water for elephants to access, so they're going to where the humans have water, and because there's drought, there's less water for humans to grow crops, so more potential impacts to food security. So the kind of broader causal landscape is impacted by climate change, human-elephant conflict, and also some interesting legislative dynamics, which I'll touch on briefly. So a big question here in this space that we're kind of still answering, as I said, this is mostly qualitative, is can community-based conservation support strategies that mitigate human-elephant conflict or the impacts of human-elephant conflict? And that's just sort of a figure describing how that could potentially work, where crop raiding might still happen or human-elephant conflict might still happen, but by the operations of community-based conservation. The impacts to the livelihood and the impacts to food insecurity could potentially be mitigated. So one way that this has happened, and one interesting and potentially globally relevant feature of this conservation landscape, is this debate around trophy hunting. Trophy hunting is one way in which many communities can receive benefits or offsets from the potential negative impacts of life with elephants. So Botswana has been in the news recently because there was a moratorium on hunting in 2014 after decades of allowing it. And this was in response to declines in overall species abundance and really global conservation goals, right? But this resulted in reduced revenue streams to local communities, and really importantly, was implemented largely without their knowledge or their consent. And as a result, there have been increases in elephant populations, right, which was the goal, but along with that, increases in human-elephant conflict. And really importantly, CBCs and these community-based conservation efforts are largely dependent on revenue from hunting along with ecotourism. So it was announced last year, what is time? But there was a moratorium, the moratorium on hunting was lifted with a huge negative response from the global conservation community. But from the perspective of people living in the landscape and the community-based conservation areas, there's a lot of support for this because of the revenue that it brings in. Okay, I'll wrap up. And this is also really important in the landscape because employment rates are relatively high. And again, as from that figure I showed you before, this is why income doesn't necessarily offset the food insecurity losses that are caused by elephants. Economic opportunities are limited, and CBCs can potentially provide meaningful opportunities to support livelihoods. The conservancies, when they function effectively, can compensate farmers whose crops have been raided, can organize community-wide deterrence to prevent crop raiding, and support local landscape planning that keeps crops away from migratory paths and elephant corridors. There are limitations. CBCs don't always function as we'd hope they would. Resources aren't necessarily evenly distributed. Participating communities are often limited in their engagement at higher levels, right? They're not necessarily consulted. They don't necessarily have the rights to manage as effectively as they'd like to. So most of those that we work with in this region really advocate for greater involvement of local communities and local community-based conservation organizations in policy decisions and in broader landscape and natural resource management decisions. So the goal, when I think about social capital in this context, community-based conservations represent a sort of strong, structured social capital space for exchange of resources, knowledge, information. And when managed correctly and when managed equitably, can really create these win-win solutions for both human livelihoods and conservation. So just to wrap up kind of the key findings from those 3 case studies, household access to capital, in particular social capital, supports adaptation behavior, which is really important for human livelihoods. Social networks, while important, don't necessarily provide all of the necessary livelihood resources that we need, as we saw in the Uganda case study. And then finally, meeting both conservation goals and human needs in conservation landscapes requires consideration of these complex human environment interactions and really amplifying the voices of the most vulnerable when we do that. All right, I will pause there.
Dr. Bailey, thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation on such an important topic and an interesting one too. I believe we have 10 minutes for questions, so anybody that has questions, feel free to raise your hand. And I see Todd has one, so feel free to unmute.
Hey Karen, thanks for this. This was great. I had a question about the Uganda case study. I had the really awesome pleasure of being able to hang out with the gorillas in Burundi a couple of years ago, and I can confirm that it is steep terrain. I couldn't believe that people can actually farm on that kind of steep terrain.
Yeah.
It's quite remarkable. But I was curious about the 30% of the households that you said were not getting their resource needs from the stretcher communities. Did you get a sense of why that was? That they weren't, were they going other places, or are they just like, what was behind that number? Do you know?
So yeah, that number was actually not that they weren't getting it from the stretcher communities. That's just they weren't meeting it, period. Right. Okay. So either I'm sorry, that wasn't clear. Either they're involved in a stretcher group, and again, to kind of highlight the overall point that stretcher groups provide a very specific type of wood product. They don't necessarily provide what people need for day to day. So even though most people are involved in the stretcher groups, they're not necessarily going to get their day-to-day wood products from them. So for most of those households, they don't have access to privately owned woodlots. Either they don't own them themselves, or they don't have a friend, family member, close person in the community that they can kind of borrow from. Or likely there's some other kind of limiting factor related to, whatever monetary access they have. Land is a really big factor. We found a strong correlation between the amount of land that a household had and their ability to meet their wood product needs. Because often there's a kind of intercropping strategy where there are woody plants growing with other types of plants. And so you might just walk through your land and collect the firewood that you need for the day. Yeah, does that kind of clarify what's going on there? It's obviously—
Yeah, so just a follow-up, so does that mean, or were you seeing them, they were then going into the managed forest, or they just weren't getting the wood they needed at all?
Yeah, I think a bit of both. So in general, there are definitely households that are not getting all of the wood that they need. We also suspect that people are definitely walking right up to that forest boundary and collecting natural resources and collecting probably firewood, most likely. That is unlikely something that we could easily get in our surveys. Sometimes people will admit to it. And actually, it's really interesting kind of the positionality dynamics. They're more likely to admit it to me than they are to some of my colleagues. But yes, there is a general concern that those households that aren't getting those wood product needs met are going to extract them from the park. But we don't have a ton of data to actually support that that's what's happening.
I see Skylar has a question too.
I do. Thanks, Karen. That was super interesting. I'm really interested in the stretcher groups too. And having never been to that area, I was just wondering how many stretcher groups are there and kind of how many people are they serving?
Yeah, they're interesting. And like I said, they've been around for a really long time. So within a given village or community, there will be multiple stretcher groups, and their sizes range from, I don't have the data in front of me, but off the top of my head, I would say on the low end, 25 members, on the high end, 300. And often they'll split, or there'll be like a schism if they get too large, right? Because at a certain point, management becomes a bit harder, and especially if you are trying to actually manage woodlots collectively and ensure that everyone benefits from them, it becomes a bit more challenging when the group is really large and you still have the same amount of land. So yeah, they're pretty variable in size, but I think that kind of encompasses the range.
Cool, thank you.
Anyone else have a question? Okay, so I think,
Laura does.
let's see. I think so. Oh,
I have a question, Ambar. Okay, yeah. I was just curious about, so for that first case study, you found that social capital is hugely important for people adopting adaptation strategies, especially sort of being involved or active with a community organization. And I was curious what that looked like. Was it sort of exchange of knowledge or direct help with adaptation strategies? Just, yeah, what does that look like?
Yeah, so again, there are a number of different types of organizations that are operational. So one is, I call them savings and loans organizations, but there are some more broader terms, but it's similar to the stretcher groups in that there's kind of a shared pot of resources that people can then rely on during times of stress. So each week or each month, people put in a set amount of money that is then redistributed as needed. And so that type of organization is obviously very structured and provides, financial capital. There are lots of NGOs that are operating in the region, and so they have often women-focused business training community organizations where folks will go and learn how to manage businesses. And it might be something like chicken husbandry, it might be something like selling crafts, it might be where there's a training for a novel product and that there's some startup capital provided. There's that sort of thing. And then there are other organizations that are more focused on actual like business growing themselves, right? So we're all gonna get an organization together for beekeeping or something like that. So there's a bit of a range. And then there are some that are more kind of social justice oriented, where there might just be general training for how to navigate conflict, how to ensure that your children are getting the nutrients and the resources that they need from their food, things like that.
Awesome, thank you.
I have a question. Following along the same lines as Laura's question, how was your experience building these connections and these bridges with the members of the communities?
Yeah, and this is a really important piece of the puzzle for me. I daily wonder if I should be an academic because I'm working with communities that are often in peril due to climate change. And there's sort of a tension between my ability as an academic to allow my research to have impact. So as of now, my strategy for that is to ensure that I have meaningful relationships with community members and to ensure that I'm asking questions, answering questions, supporting questions that they have interest in or find value in. So the way to do that is first having a lot of conversation, right? And part of the challenge is the duration of an NSF grant, the duration of a PhD, right? Doesn't often lend itself to building those relationships, those long-term meaningful relationships with communities. But my strategy up to this point, which can always be improved, is to come in from a place of without ego and humble, right? Like, here are the resources that I can bring in. Here's the knowledge and experience that I can bring in. What needs do you have? Do you even want to work with me? Is my presence here helpful or is it not? Obviously going through whatever existing governance structures operate in the region, right? So the local chairman, the Induna, the Ngozi, whoever it is, making sure you're meeting with them, you're sharing, you're being open and transparent about what your interests are and ensuring that you have their permission. And then also at the state level as well, getting, the Ugandan science and technology permits or whatever it may be. So starting there, asking questions and, strengthening the relationship over time by coming, asking questions, returning with thoughts, etc. And then also my hope, my plan, my goal, and times I've been able to do this more successfully than others, building relationships with practitioners in the region. So, other conservancies that might be operating, health organizations that can also provide resources to communities, or might be interested in data that will inform the way that they provide resources to communities. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yes, thank you. So if nobody else has questions, I believe that wraps up our very last seminar of this semester, and it was a very good wrap up. So one thing I would like to remind you all, if you guys are interested, just fill out that Bees Future Direction survey. We would really appreciate it a lot, just to receive the input of what we can do better or what we can incorporate in the future for you guys. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us, and thank you so much, Dr. Bailey, for dedicating some of your time to us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Great to see everyone.
Laura, do you want me to stop the recording?